Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you my shortbread cookies, gluten-free of course. I've been talking so much recently about my shortbread cookies, I figured it was about time to show you the recipe. Shortbread cookies are one of my favorite cookies. They're so simple to make, minimal ingredients, but so delicious. So first thing I'm going to do is preheat my oven to 350. And then I've got a couple of cookie sheets here lined with parchment paper. You could use an ungreased cookie sheet if you wanted to, but with gluten-free cookies, I find it's a little bit easier to use the parchment paper. And then I've got another piece of parchment paper for rolling. And although this is not a 100% traditional shortbread, it's a really good version, and it's my version. And the sugar that I'm using today is coconut sugar. And I'm using 1/4 cup. And most of the time when I'm substituting sugar in a recipe, with coconut sugar, I usually add the same amount. If you've ever used coconut sugar, you'll know that it's not as sweet as regular white sugar. So I don't mind using the same amount of coconut sugar. And the coconut sugar, it will turn the dough a little bit darker of a color than if you were going to use honey or white sugar. But I don't mind. And I do know that if you use honey in this recipe, which it actually turns out really well, but when you use honey, you only use 2 tablespoons. I'll put that in the description box with the recipe. But I've noticed sometimes when I use honey with this recipe, I usually have to add a little bit more flour just to get the right consistency. That's something that happens with gluten-free cooking, is sometimes you have to finagle your recipe a little bit just to make it the right consistency. So I've got 2 cups of my gluten-free flour. I do have 1 extra cup of my flour as well. That will be a little bit for rolling, and then a little bit I may or may not add extra till I get the right consistency of my dough. And then I've got a pinch of salt, and then I have 1 egg. And I know in some traditional shortbread cookie recipes, it doesn't call for an egg. But this is gluten-free flour, and it tends to be really crumbly anyways, which a shortbread cookie is really crumbly. But without the egg, it's way too crumbly, and it doesn't really hold its shape, and it just falls apart. And as I've mentioned before, because I don't use xanthan gum in my flour, that's where the egg comes in. So if your gluten-free flour blend, if you don't use mine, or even if you do use mine, and you add in xanthan gum, you could probably omit the egg. And then if you notice that your dough is really crumbly, then you could add a little bit more xanthan gum or just an egg white. That's part of the tricky thing with gluten-free baking, is sometimes we can't go by exact measurements. You really have to go by the feel of the dough. And sometimes you never know what your end result will be until you go to bake them. And then sometimes if you've added too much liquid, they just spread into a mess. So these cookies usually don't spread very much. But I've made it enough with other sugars like coconut sugar and with honey that I've learned these lessons the hard way. So my recommendation is, if you're going to err on the side of too wet of a dough or too dry, in this particular recipe, go for the drier dough than the wetter dough. And if you bake 1 tray of it and realize that maybe you need to add a little more flour or maybe a little more butter, then you could adjust that and bake the rest of your cookies. And now that I've scared you, telling you all of the things that can go wrong with this recipe, it's actually such a super simple cookie recipe. And as always, my ingredients are at room temperature. So I've got 3/4 cup of butter, which is 1 stick and a half. 1/4 cup of coconut sugar, a big pinch of salt, maybe 1/4 teaspoon of salt. My 2 cups of flour and 1 egg. And my butter, it's at room temperature, but it's not exactly as soft as I want it to be. So I'm going to soften this just a little bit in the microwave. And whenever you're melting butter in the microwave, you really want to be careful. First of all, because it will explode. And second of all, when a recipe calls for room temperature butter, you want it to be just like this, where it is mashing, but it's not really difficult to mix around. but it's not melting either. If you ever add melted butter into a recipe and it's not supposed to be melted, you'll end up with a much runnier dough or mixture, which is sometimes harder to manage, and your end results aren't the way you want them to be. So I'm just mashing up my butter just a little bit to get it broken apart. And it does stick in the whisk, but it still mashes around. And then I'm going to add in my 1/4 cup of coconut sugar and my pinch of salt. And then just give this a really good mix. Look, get the butter out of my whisk first. And this is exactly what you want it to look like. Coconut sugar does take a little bit longer to dissolve into butter than a white sugar would. But for that matter, you could even use brown sugar in this recipe, and it will change the flavor of your cookie. And once you've got that all mixed around, I'm going to add in my 1 egg and give this a really good mix. And once it looks like this, where it's kind of chunky and separated, but mostly combined, we can start adding in our flour. And I usually add in a little bit to start, and that's about half. And then I'll mix this with my whisk to begin with before I switch to my spatula. And now that it started to come together, I'm going to switch to my spatula. And now we can start scraping the bowl down as well. Now for the rest of my flour. And it may seem like it will never come together, but just stick with it, and it does. And this is just about the right consistency. And what we're looking for is for the dough to form into a ball like this. It doesn't have to be into a ball, but this helps determine if you need to add in any extra flour. If you notice that your dough is too soft, you can stir in a tablespoon of extra flour at a time. But keep in mind, we're going to be using flour to roll out the dough, and that will add in more flour as well. So now I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of flour here, and we'll start rolling out our shortbread dough. And I know they make shortbread pans. I don't have a shortbread pan. I just like to roll mine out, and then just real basic, I use a knife and cut it into squares. You could cut these into triangles, really whatever you like. And then I usually give it a little bit of help getting it flattened out. Flip it over, just so it doesn't stick. And then just start rolling it out. And then I like to flip it over and keep it moving, just so it doesn't get really super stuck to the parchment paper. And once it gets too big to flip over, I usually then start turning the parchment paper. And I'm aiming for a rectangle, but it's okay if it's not in a rectangle. Adding a little bit extra flour as needed. And then I usually feel it just to make sure it's about the same thickness all the way across. And just like any other kind of dough like this, if at any point you feel like it's getting too soft to manage, you could just lift up the parchment paper and put the whole thing on a cookie sheet and throw it in the fridge or the freezer. And this is also where you can roll these out as thin or as thick as you like. I usually go for about a 1/4 inch thickness on this particular recipe. Now that I've got my dough all rolled out, I usually just eyeball and cut it into squares. You could use a ruler if you want to and make sure your squares are exactly the same, but I just eyeball and hope that my lines are as straight as they can be. And of course, we're going to have some raggedy edged cookies, and that's fine. And then you can turn the parchment paper as needed. And then I've got a little offset spatula here just to help me lift off the dough or the cookies onto a cookie sheet. Give myself some room here, bring things closer. And even though I didn't use a whole lot of flour, it's not sticking to the parchment paper at all. And you can see that it's really holding together well. And I don't know if you can see or not, but my cookies are not all the same size. And that's fine. You really want to try to get your cookies all the same size so they all cook at the same rate, but it's all right. It'll be fine. And I don't like to put these too close together just in case they spread. Again, it's one of those things that you kind of have to eyeball. And now that I'm telling you that, I'm moving them all closer together. And even though I've got both of my cookie sheets ready to go, I'm going to do them one at a time. So this will go in the oven, again at 350 for about 20 minutes. And then while that's in the oven, I'm actually going to re-roll my little scraps here. I probably won't need to add very much extra flour at all. And I've mentioned before, one of the really nice things about gluten-free flour is there is no gluten to develop. So re-rolling our scraps, it doesn't change the texture of our cookie. And I'm really trying to do a better job at getting in a rectangle this time. That way I won't have any extra scraps to re-roll. And I don't know about where you live, but here in the United States, there's a cookie that's called a Pecan Sandie. And it's a shortbread cookie with chopped pecans in it. This recipe is so easily made into that kind of a cookie. You just add in some toasted chopped pecans, and you've got your Pecan Sandie cookie. Once in a while, I will put nuts in it. But for the most part, I prefer it just as is. So once your cookies are just golden brown around the edges like this, some of the smaller cookies are a little bit darker. And again, the coconut sugar makes these cookies a little bit darker than they would be if you had used honey or white sugar. And you can see how well they are holding together. But you saw how close they were together on the cookie sheet, and they didn't spread at all. It's why this recipe is so easily made into any shape that you like, instead of just squares like this. And these ones over here that are cooled off, you'll see they're nice and golden brown on the bottom as well. And this is exactly what you want it to be like. You don't want it to be a snap, like it's a really hard cookie, maybe that was overcooked or something. But you really want it to just break apart very easily, and it almost crumbles. And surprisingly, for a gluten-free cookie, it isn't just falling apart. This is exactly what shortbread, for me, is supposed to taste like. It melts in your mouth, it's flaky, it's a little bit crumbly, just a bare minimum of sweetness from that coconut sugar. And you might think that because there's an egg in there, it wouldn't be as crumbly and flaky like a shortbread, but it is. Now that I've started, I better just finish this cookie. So good. This is one of those recipes that every time I make them, I think, why don't I make this more often? I love these cookies. These are the kind of cookies that go great with a bowl of ice cream, a bowl of fruit. They also work really nicely as a crust for a pie. Not a fruit pie that you're gonna bake, but some kind of summer, kind of a cream pie that you would bake the crust first and it wouldn't spend an hour or so in the oven. But so delicious. No matter what kind of sugar that you use, these are a delicious shortbread cookie. And you'll notice it doesn't make a whole lot of cookies. Of course, it depends on how big you cut your cookies as well. But this recipe is easily doubled. And these cookies, once they're made, they actually freeze really well too. The only tricky thing that I've noticed with shortbread cookies, even though they look like a really firm, sturdy cookie, they're really fragile. And if you were to put these in a Tupperware container and accidentally drop it, it would probably break every single one. And that is also the nature of shortbread. But such a delicious little cookie. Not overly sweet, just the right amount. If I were serving these for a party or something like that, or giving these away as a gift, I would make them look a little bit more presentable instead of all of my misshapen squares. That's where a cookie cutter really comes in handy, unless of course you use a ruler when you're measuring your squares. Let me know what you think if you make this recipe, and let me know what sugar you use. Whether it's white sugar, brown sugar, honey, or coconut sugar like I used today. I haven't made this recipe yet with date sugar, but that is next on my list the next time I make these. But thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any questions or comments, let me know, and I'll see you on the next one.